Hello and welcome to Patching Your Server Isn't Enough, breaking down the Microsoft Exchange zero-day vulnerability. My name is Nathan Austin. I'll be facilitating today, and behind the scenes we'll be producing Stephanie Kingsleyan from Mytech, and we are privileged and I'm thankful to have Jerel Howland, the CTO of Mytech, as well as Dave Kleinatland from Huntress, who'll be going through and explaining why this particular vulnerability is different. I'll save some of that for later, but that's one of the messages we're trying to get out, and why we're doing this session is because in the past, we've all been conditioned behaviorally over the last 20 plus years, if you've been in the industry that long or in business that long, that zero-day threats come out all the time. That's not an unusual instance. In fact, there was one that came out for VMware just a few days, about a week before this Exchange one came out. And you're not hearing that one in the news. It's because that one hasn't been exploited. So one of the things that, or at least widely exploited like this one has. So part of what we're going to be talking about today is why this one is different, and why those who are still running Exchange servers need to pay attention, and there's a good chance that you might have additional mitigation to do if you haven't already done that after hearing this webinar, and that's why we're here to announce it, to raise the awareness, and here to help. So what we're going to talk about today is why this one's different and why it's more dangerous. Again, we're going to try and get into some of the technical details, but in general, we're going to try and speak technical enough to the technical audience that'll be joining us, but yet also make sure that we're connecting with those who are typically supervisory or in charge of IT at a business level, so that you also understand some of the reasons why this is different and hard and difficult, and where additional help might be warranted if you're still running Exchange. The other thing I would keep in mind for those of you watching is that there's a lot of news and articles out there about how this type of hack is something that we should expect to see more of in the future. So even if you are not experiencing a problem because you're not running Exchange, there's a chance that the information that we're going to cover today at a high level could be applicable to you for a different threat at some point in the future. So we're also trying to make sure that this raises awareness around having a good incident response plan, talking about your cyber insurance policy, making sure you have good backups, all those things that can help you recover from any type of incident that may happen in the future. So we're going to dig into real examples of the compromise, what we've seen, as well as what could come if this doesn't get addressed. And then finally, really, what can you do? What are the next actions we'd recommend? How should you proceed? As well as a note as far as if that's something you want external help, we have security experts standing by that we want to be able to help if it's something we can do. So before we dig into all that, I always like to at least touch on 1 minute about Mytech, just so folks that may or may not know who we are. We are a small and medium IT and business consulting service. We work with those organizations over the last 20 years. We've designed and built a proven IT strategy that ultimately we know can deliver consistent and proven reliable results for our clients. It doesn't mean it's the only IT strategy. It's just the one that we've learned really works and that we can stand behind, and we can deliver consistent, reliable results for our clients, because ultimately what we're trying to do for our clients is remove the IT challenges, because we all have lots of challenges. We're just trying to take some of the IT ones off the plate, so that you can end up spending more time focusing on your customers and being more adaptable to the business challenges that you may face, such as this, by trying to make sure that this isn't an issue that you have to face. And working together with our clients, it's a real partnership. That's why partners is in our name. Our clients can achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. So I always ask people, look, if that's something you want to have a conversation about, we'd love to have that conversation. No obligation, of course, but we're interested in chatting with you if you'd like. But that's not why you're here today. So let's move on to the content, and let's introduce our speakers. So Dave Kleinatland is a senior security engineer at Huntress. Dave, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, just real quick, have been doing IT work for, I don't know, 20 plus years. Was just recently at an MSP before I came here doing, technical services director role, building out support team and supporting customers. Sounds much like what Mytech supports. And now I'm over at Huntress Labs doing the kind of the security engineer thing, kind of digging in malware, poking at stuff like this Exchange vulnerability, and then helping our partners like yourself, kind of deliver that kind of security visibility into the areas that we work in. So yeah, thanks.
Awesome, Dave. Thanks for joining us. And one of the things that I really appreciate and I enjoy about Huntress is, they're just very community-minded. They are here to help. They're here to raise awareness. They're here to, like, they want to basically protect the businesses. They want to help make sure that we're all safe. And I am very thankful that they are on our team, let's say. That's a very accurate statement. So thank you, Dave. We're excited to hear from you today. Gerald, go ahead and introduce yourself as the CTO of Mytech.
Hi, I'm Gerald. I'm the CTO of Mytech, and I'm much like Dave, 20 plus years of experience managing small to medium, even large environments. Been doing Exchange for a long time, so when this started coming out, I was one of those people that was excited to figure out what was going on and start investigating the things. Also have a strong security background, so definitely driving in and starting to look at what all of this is and what the mitigations are, focused on trying to do some of that. So.
Well, awesome, Gerald. So I'm going to say one last thing, and then I'll kind of hand the rest of it over to you from a presentation perspective. But Gerald is one of the team members in Huntress. Dave, I'm sure you probably had a late night too, but on March 2nd, when this vulnerability, this 0 day was announced by Microsoft, Jerel was one of our team members that was basically had a long night and early morning into the second and into the third because it was with the Huntress team that we were able to uncover, that we learned about some of the exposures that were happening, and we were able to mitigate those that night for our clients that we were working with. But we learned how bad this thing really is and have hopefully started to create awareness. So this is one of the reasons why we're doing this, is to create awareness about why this is different. So Jerel, if you wouldn't mind, let's talk about why this is so hard and why this is a unique, challenging obstacle that we're facing with this vulnerability in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. So yeah, this vulnerability is different than what we've seen in a very long time. I would even say it's probably one of the worst examples of exploitation that I have seen. Period. This is one of the things that has really, like, before Microsoft even really released any patches, we saw huge. Well, I mean, we were seeing 20% of our Exchange servers actually either compromised or had indicators that people were attempting to compromise, stuff like that going on, which was not exactly the feeling you want when you see that patch come up from Microsoft. We were targeting this pretty early. Huntress jumped in. They were starting to see indicators, and this stuff all started before the patch actually came out. Like normally you hear about some very targeted attacks. You start seeing some of that kind of stuff, but I think this is where we've even seen a difference in this one. Is there were, in the days coming up to the patch coming out, we saw, exploitation of systems that were not directly targeted, but were more just bulk hit. I guess, Dave, if you want to chime in on what you guys saw through that.
Yeah, absolutely. In some of the early data that was released, I think in some Microsoft blog posts and some other articles, it was like, oh, these are kind of very, narrow and targeted attacks. And then probably we were going down the same path as y'all were that Tuesday, that I think it was like the second, that evening. We started grabbing a sample set of servers and saying, all right, grab me data from, like, I think we started with like 300 Exchange servers, and like 15 or so came back with signs of compromise. And out of just a random sampling of 300, that was a pretty high number. So that's when we started digging more and more and found that this actually did appear to be far more widespread, at least after some of the initial attacks may have been targeted. As it progressed a little bit, it certainly got into being very widely targeted. Yeah.
So I think to put this into a little bit more of a timeline kind of scenario, like these things, there were some pieces that kind of came out long ago. There's still a lot of things that are really being put together, but the area I'd like to point out is really when we start looking at this kind of January, February, March kind of time frame is, hey, Microsoft started noticing things, started getting some of those really targeted kind of hits back in January, and they started seeing more and more activity. And then all of a sudden, right before March, right on that February 27th kind of time frame, this is when we saw widespread exploitation, scanning, people trying to get in and actually starting to do things. Microsoft released the notice on March 2nd, and you'll notice that there's a gap there, right? There's a few days where nobody really knew what was going on. Nobody knew what was happening. We just knew that all of a sudden Microsoft said, hey, by the way, everybody's starting to do this, and here's a patch for you to start applying. We started taking that against our clients and applying it immediately. Yet that night we had all of our clients patched up and really in a good spot. But as we found out, that was too late for many of them. We actually had several clients that did have that compromise, which means that we started taking actions for that next step of remediating that, because it had been exploited and been at risk. So like this really does kind of spread into where this is, as to like there was a gap in there. There was, many times we call that the dwell time. That period of time did exist where nobody really knew that this was happening out there, and at the breadth in which it was happening. So why is this so hard? I guess.
Well, hey, Gerald, there's one last thing I'd like to point out on this last slide, if you wouldn't mind going back to that really quick, is that the notice the date that's showing the March 2nd notification, up until that point. In fact, on February 27th, the date right before that is when we were talking. I heard that we saw increased activity around the February 27th timeframe, which is also where we noticed that several of the servers that we've investigated, that's when they were hit. But then we saw like exponential additional increase of activity after the Microsoft announcement, because the hackers and bad actors knew that, well, now that this is known, I have a shorter amount of time in order to try and figure this out. And so this is one of the reasons why what we've found and what we've seen is that because of that brief window after the announcement, if you waited even till the weekend, which is a very common thing to do in this, like if, okay, it comes out on Tuesday, we're not going to take our servers down during the week because of production, we're going to wait till the weekend to do that. If you waited till the weekend to do that, chances are, if your server was exposed to the internet at all, like most Exchange servers are, you were most likely compromised. So before the second, it was like you may have around a 10 to 20% chance of being compromised prior to that announcement. But after that, because of that increased activity, and even if you just waited till the weekend, it's a near certainty that you were compromised. So that's one of the big messages why this slide was really critical, is it was really that key timeline from the 27th through about the 5th that was a real weak spot, I guess, relative to this particular threat.
Yep. No, and it is, and it's only been going up ever since then. More and more people are out there scanning for this kind of stuff. We're seeing, there are people still trying to exploit. I did build a lab, and we did see, it got exploited, right? It happens already, and that's post this period of time. So people are out there trying to break into these devices still. It's not something that's going away in the short term. So why was this so hard, right? This is like, we've encountered threats before, but what makes this one so much different? Number one, these are common servers that are exposed to the internet. Hey, we've got, what we've been finding as we've been digging around, we've been finding that people have hybrid scenarios where they're maybe they have a lot of their mailboxes up inside 365, but they still have a server on premise that was used to convert that mail up there. Maybe they're using it for administration, different actions. Maybe they've got a true hybrid where they've got mailboxes on both sides. That's still in play and exposed to the internet. Exchange by default runs best when you expose it to the internet. So that was a key component of that. And then there's even leftovers. There's people that have migrated to 365 but have not turned off that old server. We've seen several indications of that where we're starting to hit up systems and starting to see these exploited for, well, I'm on 365. What do you mean I've got an exposed Exchange server? Yeah, it's still there. You haven't locked it down. You haven't done this. You haven't done that. You still have a server on premise. I think we saw some widespread exploitation. Dave was mentioning earlier how there's a lot of, we saw this before the patch came out, right? We started seeing this across all the servers. I know, Dave, you and I were talking earlier about how we came, you guys started expanding this search, and you kept seeing more and more and more, right?
Yeah, I think on that first day, we our sample set of 500,000-600,000 endpoints, somewhere in that range. I think we had about 2,500 or so Exchange servers total that we had and are available. And I think there was over 1,000 or something. I think we had about 3,000 total, and over 1,000 or so were showing some signs of compromise. So everything moved very, very quickly, and kind of like a little bit to your last slide with that timeline, that last thing said first public POC was only available a few days later, and it just ramped up from there as we got into that following week. So yeah, it was definitely very quick and very brutally executed by the attackers.
Yep. I think the another area that was really difficult is Microsoft patches. Exchange patching is a little bit different than just running Windows Update. You can't just go on and do Windows Update and assume that your system is patched. Microsoft, with Exchange Server, SQL Server, some of that kind of stuff, you've got cumulative updates. You've got a different patch cycle. You've got a different sequence that you have to do. And there were a lot of people that either A, weren't on a patch or on a update level that could be patched and were having problems getting to that point, or they were assuming that when I ran this patch that it applied okay, and we're finding that many cases it didn't. I ran the update, even one of the servers that we ran the update and it didn't apply properly until we had to kind of knock it around a little bit to get that patch to apply properly, leaving that server continuously exposed. So we have seen scenarios where, oh, we applied all the patches, everything's fine, when it really isn't. And part of the reason why we have to make sure that we follow up and we do that continuous mitigation, right? We actually evaluate, are we sure the patch is on there, but are we sure that that patch actually solved the problem that we're expecting? Is there exploitable code still out there? And I think that's where we've had some help from Huntress is helping to define what those sample sets are. What do we have to look for? How do we identify if that system is still exploitable, both internally and externally?
Yeah, you brought up a really good point about the Exchange patching being a totally different process and different cycle. Anyone who has been an Exchange administrator has some story about a patch that did not go well in their past, right? Like at least one. And then nothing against Exchange, it's just this very complex, this very huge thing. And originally, when those updates were released by Microsoft, the security patches, there were only 5 acceptable versions that had available patches. And it took a little bit of a while, so that way some people we're going to either have to complete multiple large updates, those cumulative updates you're talking about, which means longer downtime and longer, more chances of problems. But now they've released, I think it was like this week, they released additional security patches for a lot more versions. So like that first day, there was only 5 versions that you could have actually patched right out of the gate. Now there's something like 20, I'm looking at my list here, I think it's like 24 or 25. So it did take a little while for them to get all that rolled out. So it's a really good point you brought up.
Yep. And I think it's even to the point of, the clarity that Microsoft released. I mean, kudos to them for getting this information out and really jumping on it, in an out of cycle kind of methodology. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there was still a lot of, I'm going to say, unclear advice, right? There was a lot of information out there where it's just like, well, just apply the patches. But the patches, for a long time didn't say what cumulative updates you need to be on before you could patch. And then there was just little gaps because everything was happening so fast that, it spent a lot of time. I mean, we had a couple people that did nothing but look at this kind of stuff and monitor and work on it for days, just trying to keep up with what was going on. It was moving so fast, and literally every hour there was new information coming out.
Yeah, it was a huge moving target right there in the beginning. Even the tools that Microsoft has released to kind of help determine if you had signs of compromise, or they updated those, and kudos to them for that. They got several updated those tools out in a very short time, but it made kind of those of us working on it on the early side of things, definitely a moving target. Like you said, about every hour there was something new hitting the street.
Yep. I think one of the things that also is making this very different is the types of attacks that we're seeing. They're putting in script execution. So we're starting to see, the malactors are starting to clean up after themselves. The things that we're seeing as evident points are no longer happening. They're taking actions. Even some of the raw execution that was done was done in an attempt to, they would set some settings and then they would unset those settings as part of their process to make it so that it was more difficult to see what had happened. Really trying to take some of that stuff. It was also an exploitable, this exploit could be scripted, which means that the malactors were actually out there just scanning the internet and having automation take care of it for them. Many times we think automation is great until this happens and they use it against us, right? It's You know, they were out there trying to do these same things and actually exploiting systems in mass by using, you know, scripting and the capabilities of this. It didn't require somebody to actually physically interact to attempt and break this. I think finally, this is kind of going back to some of the stuff that Dave was just talking about, where you know, the things were changing on a live basis, right? So even in the investigation difficulties, this is not something, you know, Dave and I, we've got a lot of Exchange experience. It's easy for us to be able to look at the logs and determine what's going on and understanding what's happening. But the scripts that Microsoft was releasing to solve this, to identify what was going on, seemed really simple, right? Oh, I just run this script and it's going to tell me whether or not I'm vulnerable. And it didn't, right? It actually said, here's some information. Interpret this information and determine whether or not you are, you know, at risk. Determine this information if you have been exploited. Determine all of this information. And if you don't have the knowledge of what that stuff is, if you don't have the knowledge about how to dig into the IIS logs, into the Exchange logs, into all of these different things, it's a lot more difficult to actually interpret what's happening and to actually identify whether or not you are at risk. And then they're also dropping some interesting, you know, they're exploiting the systems, but then they're leaving behind a common vulnerability format called a web shell that allows them to take those additional actions in the future. So even though you may have been exploited, nothing may have been happened other than dropping in this web shell, or they're leaving it open for themselves to take things even after you've been patched. So if you, oh, well, you know, my data is safe because I applied the patch now, everything's good, you know, I'm fine. But do you have these web shells sitting out there? And an example of this, I think this is a great example of this. If you look at this, this is a directory on an Exchange server that was exploited. Do you see the bad file in here, right? There is a bad file. Dave and I were talking about this last night. There is a bad file in here, and without going through and actually evaluating every one of these files, you're going to look at this and you're going to say, I don't see any bad files. I'm taking Microsoft's reasonable expectations as to what file is bad in here, and that bad file is, Dave, you know this, right?
Yeah, I know. It's the one that was modified, much newer than all the other ones, the Outlook EN. But yeah, it's hard to find. Yeah, I mean, that's not one that really jumped out to people at first until you start looking at those modified dates.
Yep, exactly. And well, and you look at that and you even say, well, Outlook EN. Well, what about Outlook CN, right? Is that a bad file? Is that not? Is that something that is there? Then you start deleting those files and you actually start breaking things, right? And you can actually keep patches from applying now because you start actually removing some of those other files. So you could actually be doing more damage to your system than anything by removing unnecessary files also. So this is part of that. And if we open up that.
Yeah, if you delete all these, you break Outlook web access. So anyone who uses email through their web browser, that's what gets taken down if you delete the wrong files from here.
Yep. And that's part of the reason why you expose all that stuff, right? Yep. That's one of the reasons why you have Exchange. And if we open up this file even looks fairly innocent. It doesn't look like it's malcode. It doesn't look like anything bad about it. It looks like it's output from a PowerShell command, right? But there is one little line of information in here that gives ridiculous access to the platform. If I actually look at that right there, right? Dave, you know how easy it is to run this. You know, given that information, could you do further damage to the server?
Yeah, actually, I did it live in one of our webinars that we had about this subject a few days ago. So yeah, no, it's a very easy tool for attackers to use once this file has been dropped on an Exchange server.
Yep, and it basically gives them unlimited access to run whatever they want to run on the system. And even if you knew what this script looks like, we've actually seen where it says script language JScript, we've seen C#, we've seen VScript, we've seen all sorts of different languages inside there too, which is definitely something to think about.
So, Gerald, as we move on to what's next, the natural step, one of the summary things I'd like to communicate just to either those that are in IT, meaning you're an IT professional, or if you're someone like a CFO or an operations person or president that has IT reporting to them. One of the reasons why we showed this is not because we expect you to go look at this and figure out which files are good or bad or which code is good or bad. We're just using these couple examples to illustrate how complex this issue is and how difficult it is to know what is good or bad, which is why having experts like Huntress and having security experts like we have on our team. I mean, I couldn't do this. I don't know how to look at this stuff. And I actually have some certifications in this stuff that go back 20 years. But I don't even, so you really have to be an expert to really know how to do this stuff. And so I really don't want IT people to feel bad that they don't necessarily know this, because if they're not experts in it, they wouldn't necessarily know it. And I don't want an executive to think, gosh, my IT team doesn't know what they're doing if they didn't find this stuff, because that's not necessarily true either, because this is really hard. And that's why having a partner, an external party, being able to look at this stuff in these moments is really valuable. So, and that's part of the reason why we're raising awareness, because, so that we can help increase awareness for you to be able to find this stuff in the future, or find another partner in the future, whether it's us or anybody else, to be able to make sure that you're safe. So, so with that said, Gerald, one of the things that I think is really important that we wanted to talk about, it's not next steps yet. A question came up about next steps. We are getting to that, not this next one, but after that. But I think one of the challenges that folks don't understand, and we are running against time here, is that what can happen. I mean, people sometimes feel like, well, what does it matter, my data? Like, I don't really have sensitive data, so what does it really matter? So let's talk about what bad can happen, or if you don't get rid of these compromises, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about indicators of compromise. People have somehow dropped this web shell that Gerald was talking about, which means that they haven't necessarily done anything bad yet, but it basically left the door open for them to do it in the future, and this is what could happen. So Gerald, take it away with some of these extra details.
Yeah, so the types of compromises that we either see coming or are actually seeing happening out there right now are we're seeing a lot of ransom attack, right? They're taking these codes, they're taking what they've actually dropped out on there, and we've actually seen Dave, you were mentioning that we've seen a new malware or a new ransomware variant strictly attributed to this so far.
Yeah, there's a ransomware variant called Deer Cry that's been pretty popular in the news, that it appears to be attributed mostly to being used in these types of compromised Exchange servers, or some of the other fruits of exploitation from the initial Exchange compromise. So yeah.
Yep. So they're attacking, they're encrypting and ransoming full networks, mail servers, whatever it might be that they can gain access to. They're even going after backups and starting to attack some of that kind of stuff. We're starting to see even a change in the ransomware market, where they're actually attacking backups before they actually attack the actual data, to make sure that you don't have a recovery point to kind of force you to pay certain things, right? We're starting to see where they've been making modifications to admin creds. They've been changing security rights. They've been modifying the structures of the mail system, or the servers, or the entire network, to give them access to things. That is going to lead into lateral movement. They have the capability of being anything on that server that they want to be. This will give them abilities to hop to other servers. They are now inside your network. They can run any code that they want to be able to run. This allows them to easily move between systems. Even on a high level, they have access to your Exchange server. This basically means that they can gain access to all your mailboxes. We now start seeing business email compromise come into this, right? Business email compromise gives people the ability to modify your mailbox and say, I'm going to intercept email, I'm going to redirect email, I'm going to do that kind of stuff. I was reading about a company that does a bunch of real estate closings, title transfer type stuff for both commercial and residential work, and they're saying that they had business email compromise against these kinds of things from the Exchange compromise, that people were, they're now having to investigate every wire transfer that they've had done to make sure that there aren't wire transfers that are happening, make sure that they're going to the right accounts, making sure, because they've actually identified that people have had access to mailboxes that shouldn't have had. Data exfiltration, taking some of that data. Hey, we've got patents or sensitive information, or business critical information that's going on inside of our environment. Start taking that stuff out, right? I've been emailing these documents back and forth inside our organization. I can scan your entire mailbox and look for that information and start figuring out what we're going to do. That's the dangerous stuff that's going to happen. We're starting to see that really happen as a big component at this point.
Yeah, and Gerald, there's two other little things that I like to illustrate relative to this stuff, to really try and say, like, this is why this could be widespread. And is that the lateral movement. So one of the things we mentioned earlier is that about a week before this Exchange vulnerability was announced, a VMware zero-day vulnerability. Well, one of the requirements to be able to exploit that vulnerability is you had to have access to the network. Well, guess what? 1 week later comes this vulnerability, which basically allows people access to the network. And if you haven't patched or updated the firmware on your VMware, now they could have access to your VMware, which gives them access to everything. And that's as if you haven't patched your VMware too. So that's one of the things, and a lot of small businesses use VMware, even if it's the free version or the low cost version. And the other thing around business email compromise, I know you illustrated the real estate firm. If you're like, well, I'm not in real estate, or I'm not in a company that does transactions a lot. Well, I'll give you another example of something that could happen to anybody. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, because typically you're going to have vendors or customers that you send invoices to and they pay you. So one of the common things that business email compromise will do is they'll infiltrate your accounting email or your CFO email, whomever sends those invoices. They'll learn what you're doing, and they'll send invoices that are fake invoices, or maybe the exact same invoices that you already have in your system to send to these folks, to your customers, and they'll change the billing address, or they'll change the wire transfer information, and then now your customers pay you because they think they're paying you, but they're actually paying it to whoever exploited the environment. So that could happen to anybody, and that actually did happen to one of our clients, not relative to this exposure, but that did happen to a client in the past where they had given up credentials to their email, and for everything that they knew, everything was running just fine until they found out that tens of thousands of dollars were sent that was in theory supposed to be sent to them, got sent to these bad actors. So that is a very real thing that could happen to anyone. And this threat basically gave everyone access, or these folks access to your email, to be able to do that pretty easily. So I like to try and relate it to, like, this could happen to anyone if this is what you're running. So thanks for indulging me on that. Yep. So what's next, Gerald?
Well, so what do you do, right? So, hey, we started. Oh man, okay, this is a big deal. I do have Exchange. Let's actually, assess our exposure, our risk. Do we see attempts of exploitation? Have we patched? Did we patch in time? Where are we at with all of that kind of stuff? Maybe we find some signs that something did happen, right? Well, step one, launch an incident response plan. Yeah. How many people have an incident response plan, right? This is probably the area. I know, Dave, you're chuckling about this, right? Because this is something that small business does not think about, right? They don't think of the incident response plan, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely something that we, kind of stress upon people, right? Like, know what your plan is ahead of time, because the worst time to create an incident response plan is in the middle of an incident. So if you don't already have one, it's certainly a good idea to start putting some thought and time and effort into creating one. That way, when you're in crisis mode, it's much easier to get through.
Yep. So what we're going to do in this case is, hey, we don't have an incident response plan. So what do we need to do, right? So let's actually start going down and reviewing that cyber insurance policy. That should be one of your first steps. Every policy is different. You have different rules that come out of that. If you aren't, you might have to have certain companies involved, or you might have to do certain forensic analysis to have coverage. Every policy is different. Make sure you look at that if you're going to have to do any kind of, coverage from that kind of a scenario, right? If we're seeing IOCs, we should be contacting, the cyber insurance. We should be determining whether or not we're going to be bringing in security forensics. Are we going to actually have somebody come in, determine how detailed, how much data was taken out? Was there data taken out? How deep is it? Doing that kind of stuff, really taking that next level. And maybe even just saying, okay, well, we see that they did, this is as far as they went. And actually doing that restore, right? So we found a couple of web shells, but we were able to identify that those web shells really didn't do anything. We did DR actions to get us back to prior to the incident actually happening, getting a DR state back, getting everything back into a clean state, being in a good spot, making sure that we were patched so that we didn't get recompromised. Definitely making sure that we were in a good spot right off the bat. And so the sooner you can do that, obviously the easier it is. The longer that this goes, the longer people's backups start becoming questionable. You start running into potential issues with, how much data you have to restore. Are you going to lose data when you have to restore back that way? Just a lot of things that start taking action. Okay, we've locked it down. We've gotten that server cleaned up. We've maybe isolated it or segmented it, done something like that. We should continue to closely monitor that network, knowing that there may have been malactors inside of it, watching the outbound traffic, maybe putting in some enhanced security features, utilizing tools to kind of investigate everything on the network, not just that server anymore. Do we have options to make sure that these are protected? Should we be moving to O365 so we don't have this issue again? Is this server even necessary in the environment anymore? We can really start looking at stuff. Are there firewall rules that we can do to start limiting some of these actions? All of that kind of stuff are part of those next steps. And then, hey, this is an opportunity for us. We just discovered that most of the time they don't have these incident response plans. Maybe we should build one. So how do we actually build this incident response plan? Start building one so that if this happens again, that we have a game plan for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, Gerald, I appreciate kind of this laid out. And so, if you hopefully you have a cyber insurance policy, if this is something, if you don't, but that's something to consider as well. If this is something that you're concerned about, unfortunately, if this isn't an incident that is affecting you and your organization, it's a good opportunity to review your coverage. The other thing that we can't state enough is make sure your backups are good. Make sure your backups are good and protected, because there's certain ways in which backups are set up. I spoke to someone last week who had their backup was just a USB hard drive attached to their server, and unrelated to this event, but they got completely ransomed and encrypted. And guess what? Because of the way their backup was set up, they also encrypted their backup. So backup was not an option. So there are very specific ways that your backup should be set up to allow you to recover from an event like this, and as well as to segment it so that the bad actors can't get to it, to encrypt it so you can actually use it in an event like this. So if you haven't had a chance to review your backup status lately, I would highly recommend that, and make sure that you have enough amount of coverage. One of the incidents we ran into was the backup didn't go back far enough to be able to recover to prior to the incident of compromise, or the indicator of compromise. So what is your backup window that you want? So just reviewing all of these different variables, as well as one of the other challenges that we've found is that most small businesses, and I would even argue most mid-market and most mid-market businesses, so up to say 1,000 to 3,000 people in the organization, don't have some of the security tools that would help them even find this stuff, or even uncover if there's other threats that exist, or if they've been able to get inside of the environment. So part of what I mean by review options to mitigate future threats is, figure out where have a really honest and candid conversation with your team and with potential external partners to identify, do they have the expertise to be able to find things like we've covered today? Because if not, proactively working with a partner and finding a partner that can be that expert, because again, a fractional expert even, so that way you don't have to bring those expensive resources on your team, but you might be able to outsource some of that stuff to a partner. And yes, we are one of those partners, but even if it's not us, it should be somebody, because if you don't have those capabilities internally. And then finally, like Gerald said, I think this definitely opened up. We've been fortunate with our clients. We haven't really had a lot of incidents to deal with that have gotten bad, because we've always been able to go to backups, because we know we do a good job with our backups. But making sure to have a good incident response plan and understanding your cyber insurance policy requirements, and who should be contacted. Do you have attorneys you need to deal with? Depending on if you're in a compliance industry or not, if that data was accessed, is it a notification thing like HIPAA? If you have a Department of Defense contracts, all kinds of things as far as what you might need to do, thinking through that so you know what actions to take in the moment. As Dave said, you don't want to be making this stuff up when you're trying to make decisions quickly to mitigate what could be going on. Because every day, every hour that passes is, if there's a vulnerability in your network, if there's a compromise on your network, every hour that goes by, it could be compromised. And so that's really what we're trying to help make it aware. So Dave, any other comments on this one before we move on, as far as recommended actions that you've seen from out of companies?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. The only thing that, I'll kind of reiterate a little bit is a lot of people are like, oh, I have cyber insurance, I'm good. Well, call that cyber insurance person, when you're not in the middle of an incident, right? And figure out what the procedures are and where you have to go. Write those numbers down of who you need to call, who you need to talk to ahead of time. That way you're not just calling the 1-800 number on the day of the incident and trying to go through the phone tree and figure out what to do when that's part of the incident response plan. But in a couple of talks that I've given before where we talk about this, it's like, vet it all out, like you talked about, checking those backups, make sure they're good. Backup isn't any good until you've actually tried to restore from it, right? It's one of those things where, definitely check that kind of stuff out and vet the whole process as if it has already happened, when you're not in the middle of an incident. Now, if you're in the middle of this incident and you've got to do this, then absolutely, go ahead and push forward and get through it. But for the future, go ahead and plan to make it easier.
Thank you, Dave. Well, Gerald, let's go to the next slide where we really want to just be candid and be available. So one, we're trying to say, look, if you have any doubt, if you're an IT team member and you're not sure if you've secured your Exchange server, or if you're an executive who an IT reports to you and you're not sure if this has been handled, reach out, speak up, do not stay silent. And I say get the owners of risk involved. When I mean the owners of risk, it's who is the ultimate accountable person in your organization that makes decisions about the risks the organization chooses to take or not. That's oftentimes a president or CFO, CTO, executive CEO. It's one of those folks. Don't be silent, because if you stay silent just because you're worried that oh my gosh, what if I didn't do this right, and I don't want to bring awareness to something, maybe I didn't do it right. Well, it's better if you actually say something and get someone involved that can help double check your work. In every server that we investigated, we didn't always find a compromise. We found attempts of compromise, but in every single server that we investigated, there was something that was missing, something that server was still potentially vulnerable. And so that's one of the reasons why we put our team together. That's why we're doing this webinar. It's not because we're trying to do this as some sort of a sales pitch. That's not why we're doing this. We're doing this because this is hard. This is very real, and we've seen it have bad impacts, and we've seen people that are vulnerable that didn't realize they were vulnerable, and we want to be able to help shore up that problem. So reach out. Again, most SMBs don't have not only the security expertise, like the team like Dave at Huntress and Jerel, for example, and they don't have the tools to be able to help uncover these exploits. So by all means, so Stephanie posted a link in the Q&A, and it'll be in a follow-up email. We basically have a landing page that says, hey, if you want us to have a brief conversation about this, or if it's something you want us to dig into with you and with your team, happy to do it. This is a one-time thing. We just want to try and help make sure this problem is not going to affect you. And even if you're watching this at a later date and you've already mitigated this risk, one of the other things that we do is we really try and help our clients and the community be autonomous in executing a lot of these things. So we have a bunch of future virtual training and power user groups where we really try and work collaboratively with those folks in your organization around things like this, but as well as around other operational aspects of technology. So again, if you have any doubt, please reach out. We want to be able to help. And it's okay. Speak up. Rather you say something than stay silent and then find out, weeks or months later that you got exploited because this issue wasn't addressed sooner. So, all right. Moving on to the next slide. Final comments, Gerald, Dave. Before we open it up for questions, anything that any tips or nuggets of information you want to make sure that folks take with them before we sign off?
Yeah, I think from my standpoint, it's strictly like make sure that you are safe on this one, right? This is just I don't know that I've seen one worse than what this is going around. There are some bad things that have happened in the past, but this one is active. It is moving. People aren't taking it as seriously as they should be, and quite honestly, it scares the bejeebies out of me that is happening that way. It's just, if you have an Exchange server, if you've had an Exchange server, just anything that you think that you might have this, even if you think, oh, I've got it all locked down, I've got it behind a firewall, I've got everything secured, we're finding places where everybody thought that was the case until we actually poked at a couple things and identified that no, it's completely exposed. It is getting hit by people. People are trying to get into it. It is happening. This is just one of those things that we need to make sure that gets locked down. Dave, you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely one of the kind of more widespread and more vulnerable attacks that we've seen people to. So like Gerald mentioned, if you've heard the phrase, even if you're not on the tech side, right? If you've heard Microsoft Exchange or maybe even the term mail server, in your office, and there was one, or there's this box whirring away in a closet somewhere that has ever done anything with mail, it's worth at least double checking all that stuff or triple checking it, because we have found a lot of instances where partners have told us, hey, we patched the server, can you check it? And we find out that that patch maybe didn't apply entirely properly. And patching doesn't mitigate any exploits that have already occurred, right? Like, so if you patch it, but like they still have some of those files you were talking about earlier, the web shells, those attackers still have control of the machine. So having someone check it out and look at it is probably not a real bad idea. It's actually a really good idea. And to have someone check it out and look at it should not be all that involved. It's usually a pretty quick process to go in there and dig and look at that Exchange server and see what they find. Now, what that turns into and where they go from there may actually, stretch out a little bit more. But getting that first opinion on it should not take too long and be a pretty simple process.
Yeah, Dave, thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. It actually is relatively quick to do some initial kind of investigation and identify if there's indicators of anything going wrong, because our team has learned and trained on what to look for. So we're able to typically find that within an hour of engaging and getting access. And then we run some deeper scans to be able to kind of see if there's anything else that we find. But yeah, it's a relatively quick, within a few hours of engaging, finding out. Yeah, and then just as a high note before we sign off finally is that, we've been working with Huntress and the team and other folks. There's high credibility that there's about 67,000 plus Exchange servers in the U.S. that are known to be compromised. So if you have an Exchange server, there's a good chance that you might be one of them, and that's why we're bringing this awareness that this is more widespread than what we've seen in the last 20 years of threats, at least in my experience, as far as how it's being exploited and how widely spread this one is. So thank you all for attending this session today. We will sign off for those who need to sign off, and we'll open up for questions and stick around here for a few more minutes if any questions come through. So there is a question that just came through. It says, and Dave, I think this one might be for you if you have any awareness of it. The Buffalo, New York school district had a ransomware attack this week. Any info on whether that was related to this vulnerability?
Yeah, I was actually just looking through that real quick. I saw that question pop up, and I don't know if that's I don't know if that's attributed to part of this vulnerability or not. I don't see any specific mentions of that one ransomware variant we talked about earlier that does appear to be related to the Exchange vulnerability. So yeah, not sure on that one. If they may not have released the details of what ransomware variant was used. The timing's there, but that doesn't necessarily mean it line up. Those kind of ransomware attacks happen, unfortunately, all the time.
Yeah, Dave, as we actually got a call last Friday from a company in Colorado that their entire network was completely encrypted and ransomed, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah. And the first question I asked was, do you have an Exchange server? Because again, the timing was right, but it ended up being an independent thing. It was not related to having an Exchange server. Yeah. But again, this is just one of those that, again, I feel like from a timing perspective, the key variable was the two numbers that I've been trying to make sure that people understand, just for them to be introspective about how it may have affected them, is that if they patched immediately, like the day of the announcement, they have probably somewhere between a 10 and 20% chance that they were already compromised. And if they waited to the weekend, so gave it a few more days, there's a near certainty that they're compromised or have something wrong with their server. So depending on which bucket you might fall into, just again, be introspective about that, and as far as how you dig in to investigate this. Looks like, let me see if there's, I think there's one other question came up. Oh, it just got published here. So in our investigation, we found that the Exchange patches that MS released didn't apply properly. How common is it for updates patches to not properly apply? And do you recommend always checking after installing patches? Good question.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know, Gerald, me, whatever. We're both Exchange admins, so whoever wants to take
it. Go for it, Dave.
Yeah. So, like you probably heard earlier, Gerald mentioned that Exchange patching is different, so it's a different, it's a whole different animal in its sense. So I would say be extra vigilant, especially when applying Exchange patches, to make sure that those have been actually applied properly. There are several blog entries from like Microsoft and whatnot that show you how to verify that. There's some versioning on some files you can check to make sure that it's there. So if you're on that IT administrator side, there is some good data out there on checking some certain file versions to make sure that the patch did in fact apply properly. I'd say patches overall, and I'll let Gerald chime in on this too. General Windows patches and stuff, pretty reliable. You know, the normal Windows update process, that usually goes really well and you don't need to sit there and double check every one of them. But the more complex systems like Exchange or maybe SQL for databases or any of those line of business softwares that have like multiple layers of complexity, those are the ones that need that extra eye.
Yep, and what I would add to that is, especially, I think this is one of the scenarios that this kind of came out of band. So, you know, I know Microsoft was planning to release this patch very soon, potentially the week after. You know, I don't know what that exact timeline is, but I also don't know what QA actions that Microsoft, quality assurance actions that Microsoft may have been attempting to run to validate that these patches apply properly, to fix all these little glitches that happen when they find these kinds of things. I don't know whether or not any of that was done, right? And so especially in this scenario, I think this is the difference between something that's gone through the appropriate processes and are part of a normal patch cycle, many times works better than these emergency patch kind of things, right? These things that come out last minute, you need to get them on. This is just rule number one. If you have an emergency patch, you always check to make sure that that patch is doing what you expect it to do. And especially with things that are exposed to the internet or, you know, have these kind of vulnerabilities. If this was a server that was, you know, many times a SQL server sits holistically internally, it never actually is exposed to the internet, sometimes not even blocked from being able to talk to the internet. If that kind of stuff is the case, it's a completely different cycle. It's a different, you know, methodology. It's a different testing process. But when you have something that's exposed to the internet and you're fixing a risk that is exploitable from the internet, that is, you just do everything in your power to make sure that it is valid.
Yeah, Gerald, so, and Dave, both of you just made me think of a common, and I know there's another question that just came in, but in the interim, one of the things that I feel is for especially as organizations maybe a little bit larger, they might have some integration with Exchange, for example, and so they might be in this hybrid environment, right? So so you might have an executive that's like, oh, we're in Microsoft 365, but they might not realize the hybrid, or you might have hybrid and you're like, well, because we're hybrid, I've locked our Exchange server down, so it doesn't have external access. So can you talk through just a couple of the kind of gotchas to be aware of? So for even of those folks that might have like a hybrid environment from on-premise Exchange and Microsoft 365, and maybe it's just an interim step as you're making this migration happen, but can you just talk about like what are some of the gotchas there? Because I feel like that people are thinking that there might not be vulnerable if they're in that environment, but there are some gotchas where they still might be. So and then I'll get to the next question.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, there's a lot of organizations that have had on-premise Exchange setting up through 365, migrate up to 365. They have all their mail up there now. You know, there's a lot of IT people that will still continue to have a hybrid environment for management or for being able to do certain actions on their local network. It can make certain things easier. So there's a lot of IT people that think that it's, you know, necessary to maintain that hybrid environment. The trick is that hybrid environment also needs to be exposed to the internet to talk to Microsoft. You can lock it down so it only talks to Microsoft, but did you do that properly? Did you, you know, how narrow did you make that scope? Did you say, you know, anything in Azure? Did you say only Microsoft? Did you, you know, how sensitive did you make that? Because that's where that risk still comes in. I think the other side of that is people have performed the migration and then disconnect everything, but don't actually turn off that server, right? Don't actually remove the services, don't actually break everything. And it's still sitting out there, exposed, accessible, exploitable in this scenario.
Yeah, thanks, Gerald. Appreciate that. That's where wanted to hit on that because I know that it's somewhat related to the rest of the conversation. And then So here's a question that came in. If employees have Outlook, Teams, et cetera, the apps downloaded on their phones or tablets and connected to a company server, would this compromise their personal devices?
I mean, from what we've seen on the web shells and whatnot that are being used to exploit, we haven't seen anything that would specifically attack a personal device. But if someone does gain full control of an Exchange server, they may be able to, send malicious emails or execute commands from that Exchange server. I know Exchange servers, depending on how you have it configured, may have the ability to wipe devices or lock devices out. We haven't seen or heard of any activity like that. We're just talking about things that are possible right now. As far as like infecting the iOS or Android device, especially if it's not jailbroken or rooted or hacked or whatever, I'd say that is unlikely, but it's not out of band to think that they could do malicious things or damage to the contents of those personal devices, depending on how the policies and stuff are set up. I haven't seen any activity or reports of activity like that, but in the cybersecurity side of things, we're always working in the realm of possibility in those edge cases, and it is totally possible. Hopefully that's a clear enough answer. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave, yeah. Great. And I think there's also, Gerald, and I wonder if you might be able to speak maybe a more likely scenario of the lateral movement that could be seen, and how an example of something where that we saw evidence of things like evidence of code execution, but then what did it execute, and kind of not knowing. So can you speak a little bit to that, about some of the things that are possible there and more likely relative to other devices outside of the Exchange server?
Yeah, many times your Exchange server is sitting right next to all of the other servers in your network, your file servers, your domain controllers, your SQL databases, line of business apps, that kind of stuff. And if it is, that's where they can use that server to gain access to that. I think even to go back a little bit into that question about whether or not the other devices are at risk, I think the area that could be a potential compromise point is that business email compromise scenario, where they can then use that to send an email saying, hey, download this app, impersonate the IT person, impersonate the owner of the company, do something like that, saying, I need you to do these actions that would then install some kind of a malicious software or malicious action. Maybe on the PC, I need you to update your QuickBooks, right? Do something like that that's actually getting pushed down. That is not a legitimate email, but it looks like it's coming internally. It looks like it's coming from the CEO or the CFO of the organization, and you don't know any different. And so you click blindly and execute the program. I think that's probably the more likely scenario for some of that device access. But yeah, the lateral movement is a scary possibility. We aren't seeing a ton of it yet, but it is still, I think the longer that this stuff sits out there, the more likely that we're going to start seeing that.
Yeah, and Gerald, we just did a session a couple of weeks ago on how to spot a phishing email. And the example that you just gave, none of the typical ways to spot a phishing email would be evident, because it would be coming from your actual email server. It would have the exact same signatures. Anything that was associated with that would be part of it. So that would be definitely a difficult exploit to identify, because of the common things that we've all been trained. If you do any type of security awareness training with your team to be able to spot phishing emails, this could completely bypass nearly all of those, because they have access to the Exchange server.
Yeah, and that's a tactic that attackers are already used to, especially if they gain control of a mailbox. They already know how to create the necessary forwarding rules and stuff to say, hey, if you get a reply or whatever with the subject, hide it from the user that gets it, so they don't know that I'm using their email. So they already know how to manipulate that really well. And I haven't actually tried one of them out or not yet, but we have seen some proof of concepts get posted to use these existing exploits simply to just exfiltrate email, to just take email from a mailbox and stuff like that. So haven't actually put hands on those, so I don't know if they're working or not, but we do know the attackers are at least thinking about it.
All right, well, seeing no more questions at the moment, as someone did ask, this session is recorded. We will send a follow-up email with a link to the recording that's on our YouTube channel, and we post everything there. So if you like this content or more, subscribe to our YouTube channel or subscribe to our list. You'll always get these notifications of any of these types of events. And again, if in doubt, please reach out. We're happy to help, even if it's just to have an initial conversation, and if this is something you want to pursue or not. This is not something that we're trying to, this is not a profit gaining thing for us. This is candidly, we just know that this is worse than any other exploit we've seen in 20 years. And we want to increase awareness and make sure that something really bad doesn't happen to you in the future. And we know, as Dave mentioned earlier, that within just like a few short hours of engaging, we could be able to validate or not whether or not you have something to worry about. And that's really all we're trying to accomplish, is to be able to help in that regard. And so spread the word. If you know folks, anybody that you know that might have an Exchange server, again, we're just trying to spread the word, whether it's us or anybody else. We just want them to make sure they do some due diligence, do some double checking, and reach out to a security partner like us or somebody else if you're in doubt, and we're happy to help. So with that said, thank you all very much. Dave, thank you for joining us from Huntress, and I really appreciate your partnership. You guys, I love having Huntress on our team, looking out for us and looking out for our clients. So thank you for your partnership. And Gerald, I know you've had some long nights in the last couple of weeks as well. Thank you for everything you do. For everyone who attended, I appreciate your time, and take care in the future, and we hope to talk to you soon.